Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. Yes, I'm not doing my Ray Charles impersonation this morning. I am out on location in beautiful Castle Rock, Colorado, enjoying some warmer weather, some great sunshine. And this week's episode, we have Marvin Storm with us, and Marvin is helping entrepreneurs do that thing that, and I'll raise my hand and stand right there next to the crowd, that we don't ever think about. We prepare for business, we set up our business, we do all kinds of business plans, we execute our business, we run around, and man, we're winning, but we never think about how to exit and how to do something right. Marvin, great to the show. Great welcome you to the show, man.
All right, this is great. I like that you're on location there, and this is great. I've never done a remote on location interview like this, so this is cool.
Modern technology, right? Right. So Marvin, I mean, a lifetime of business, a lifetime of experience. What was the catalyst that got you to start thinking about exits and focusing on exits for entrepreneurs?
Well, I guess because I've sat in that chair of the entrepreneur. It can be a lonely place sometimes, and you try to figure things out as you go, and entrepreneurs become really good at that. I actually got my start. You mentioned earlier when we were chatting offline here about accountants, and that's where I started my career. Actually got my degree in accounting, and my father was an entrepreneur and had his own business, and I watched the ups and downs and the hard work and the long hours and no vacations. And so I didn't have any illusions about the difficulty, but he sailed his own ship. He didn't answer to anybody. And I always it kind of stood back in awe sometimes and kind of admired that. After I got my job and, with a large national accounting firm at the time, Deloitte, and what is now Deloitte. And I did that for a while, and I was playing pickup basketball and got real friendly with the guy. And before you know it, we're talking business and dreams and aspirations. And we turned in our resignation and rented a small office in downtown and got a couple of desks that were facing each other and a couple of phones, and we were in business. And
and I love that it started on a basketball court too. That's awesome.
Yeah, well, sometimes we take circuitous routes to get what we end up doing, but we had a great ride. We were kind of lucky. We were kind of in the right place at the right time, and the business grew. We went from that small office to renting an entire floor and had dozens of people working for us, and it was great. But as business and things change, and the economy changed, and the tax laws changed, which we were kind of reliant on at the time, and more importantly, I had a co-founder that he was older than I was. And so his idea and goals and aspiration were a little bit different than mine. And so we just agreed that it was time that we would step away from the business. And we did. I went right, he went left. And I then started another business as he did, entirely different fields. And so over the years, I've acquired businesses, started businesses, and the last business that I got involved in and exited, I had acquired it. It was a business that needed to be repositioned. I was on the board of directors of that company, and they eventually approached me along with, some other board members and asked me if I kind of wanted to, acquire it and take it over, and they would provide some of the capital. And so I did. And that was a great ride. And so a few years ago, I stepped away from that business. And your question was, how did I get doing what I'm currently doing? And when I went from the fast lane, I spent years, decades, working, building my own thing, scaling business. And, the dream of everyone is to eventually take it easy and smell the roses. And so I moved from the far left lane over to the far right lane into the slow lane, and even at points was parked on the side of the road. And I found, that's not very exciting. It's kind of boring, actually. You have the pedal to the metal for so many years, and all of a sudden, you're going, 40 miles an hour instead of 90. And life doesn't have the excitement that it did, especially if you have that entrepreneurial profile where you're used to getting up and making things happen and figuring out problems and executing them and solving them and moving on to the next thing. And then all of a sudden, I'm not much of a golfer. And so that didn't last long. I moved from the San Francisco Bay Area up to where I live now, which is, more rural. And I thought I would spend a lot more time skiing, only about an hour from Lake Tahoe. And that didn't, I just, the Black Diamond runs were a little intimidating when the older I got. And so I didn't spend as much time skiing, only with grandkids who embarrassed me. And so I just got to thinking about all the experience that I'd had and the different exits that I'd had. And I love podcasting. I listen to a dozen podcasts every week, and I'm going to do a podcast. And as I thought about it and looked at who else was doing podcast in this niche out there, almost everybody else interviews the actual entrepreneur that sold a business or had a business experience. And they talk about those experiences. And I thought, what was so important for me was the actual deal makers, the M&A advisors, mergers and acquisition specialists, the CPAs, the transaction attorneys, wealth managers, investment bankers, business brokers, people that kind of make the deals happen. They do this every day, all day long, and they have dozens, if not hundreds of stories over a career that they could talk about, the good ones that went really well and what can be learned from those transactions that went well, and some ones that were challenging that went sideways and didn't do so well, maybe didn't even get sold or closed. And then some real sad ones that, the entrepreneur dropped the baton on that last lap, and it destroyed him and his family financially, his employees, the people that relied on him. He just, there are some real sad stories that are told. And the interesting thing is that most of the time, 95% of the time, if you take control and you actually think through a process, it's not rocket science, but entrepreneurs are this odd breed of individuals that, they get excited. I just described, kind of my situation. I was excited to get up in the morning and solve problems and move on to the next one. And entrepreneurs get this, they do the same thing every day, and they become really, really good at it. And they're good at shooting from the hip. They're good at figuring out things on the fly. They take risk. They walk, through walls, and they get the idea a lot of times that when it comes to selling or exiting their business, they're going to do the same thing. They're just going to figure it out when they get there. Unfortunately, the statistics and data doesn't support that kind of strategy because they don't do it all the time. And this may be a once or twice event. And since, 70% of entrepreneurs, founders' net worth is tied up in his business, generally. Those are the statistics. And if you have 70% of anything tied up in one asset, you better pay attention and keep your eye on the ball. Because you want to monetize that, turn that asset, especially if it's a business, into cash. And you want to optimize it and maximize it. And the probability of you doing it well and at the spur of the moment and shooting from the hip and checking all the boxes to optimize the value of that business is not all that great. But unfortunately, entrepreneurs just think when the time comes, magic will happen, and they'll have people lined up to buy their business and throwing money and cash at them. And rarely, it does happen occasionally, but rarely does it happen. And so I just thought, I'll talk to these, professionals that do this every day, and they can share real life experiences that if an entrepreneur listens to these experiences and learns from them in an entertaining way, they can by osmosis learn things that they should be doing and things that they shouldn't.
Just crushing the dreams of all the entrepreneurs out there who thought the exit would be easy and all be roses. I'm really curious. There's one, Dad. What in those first few podcast episodes, how eye-opening was it right away? Because like you said, you had some experience already with business exits, and you already had, from the entrepreneur's perspective and some successful exits, seen a good deal of it. So was it still a huge gap of knowledge once you started talking with these folks?
Well, I can tell you one thing. If I would have listened to podcasts and listened to these experts and professionals of all the weird deals and the twists and turns and unusual things that happen, some of which happened to me, I would have been in a much better place. And so when you asked, was it an eye-opening experience? I was just blown away at the different permeations of a relatively simple, straightforward transaction, and all of the odd and weird things that come out of left field and derail a transaction that no one thought of or planned for, and the mechanics of how you kind of work through those situations, and don't let it overwhelm you, and keep the transaction together. And so as I went through and listened, because the format of the podcast is every episode has 4 transactions, 2 that went well, and maybe really, really well, and why, and 2 that didn't go all that great, and the reasons for it not going so well. And so it's kind of a Reader's Digest version. Every episode is 45 minutes to an hour, and 4 Reader's Digest versions of these transactions and the takeaways. And I still do an episode, and things that I had never even considered, even after I've done hundreds of stories, weird things just come out of the blue. And it's just interesting that I've had folks listening to the podcast say, geez, I'm glad I listened to that episode. I'm just like that guy. I don't want that to happen to me, and that's very gratifying. Yeah.
That begs me to answer. Give us the weird one. Give us at least one of those weird ones. Cause I'm thinking of what is that, the commercial, the Farmers Insurance, it's where we've been there, seen that, whether it was the bear driving
we can
the
fix it
car,
all because we've seen it all, or
yeah,
something like that.
There you go. There you go.
Well, I'll give you not a weird one, but a sad one. And it's all about timing and an entrepreneur's ego. There was a company a number of years ago that was worth about $5 million, had been in business for 2 generations, 30 odd years, and the baton had been passed on from the founder to the daughter who was running the business at the time. And, she didn't have to go through all of the difficulty and growing and sacrificing that her father did. And, unfortunately, she just thought that she was smarter than the average Joe. And so when it came time, they decided that it was time to exit. And she was looking forward to monetizing and making all this money. She owned a significant share of the business, as did her father. And they went to market. They had an M&A advisor, and they went to market. And the economy was a little soft. Their sales had sort of plateaued. And the offers they got just weren't, what she was envisioning. And not only were the offers not that great, the terms associated around the offer was going to require less down, kind of an earn out. And an earn out is when you don't get all your money at once. You have to earn it over a period of a year or 2. And she just absolutely told her advisor to tell the guy to go pound sand. And he was going to write a very healthy check, take it over. It wouldn't get all the money, right at once. And she just, unfortunately, I'm trying to say this politely, but arrogantly, just thought that, I have such a great business, we'll find somebody else that will write it. Less than 2 years later, they ended up closing the business because of the economy continued to soften. They were leveraged. And another competitor came into town that was offering a similar service for less money. And she just wasn't able, she hadn't that experience to respond to that competitive threat quickly. And it just overwhelmed her, and they ended up going out of business. And I got nothing for the business. It was liquidation. And, so, you go through stories like that. And if you're an entrepreneur listening to this and you think, well, gee, that kind of sounds like me, maybe maybe I shouldn't have such a big ego, and just by listening to somebody else like that. And then there's the flip side. There are stories where, I'll give you another example. A company that, when you have a business and it's doing well, you have people calling you all the time wanting to buy your business, and these might be actual other companies or entrepreneurs that are doing research, and they call you, or it may be a fund, a private equity fund that calls you up, and they have people that get on the phone and dial for dollars, and they're looking to engage in a conversation. And this guy, wasn't really thinking about selling, but it had sort of, maybe someday. And then he got this inbound call from a company in the same industry that he knew very well. It was a larger company, and they entered into this discussion. And he wasn't using anyone to help him. They just came to terms, and within a few months, they had gone through a lot of the due diligence, and this offer was a reasonable offer on the table. And then COVID hit, and everything goes into slow motion. The buyer said, well, we just need to wait, still interested, but let's put things on hold to see how this all shakes out. And of course, the buyer and his wife are all teed up to sell the business and move on. And they were in this frame of mind that they were not wanting to sell now. And so at that point in time, he reached out to a mergers and acquisition advisor. The advisor came and looked at his business and said, I think if we do a few tweaks here and approach different types of buyers out there, I think we may be able to generate quite a bit of interest and maybe a little bit better offer than what you got. That's great. Let's go. And so this, 4 or 5 months later, the M&A advisor had worked with him, created kind of a pitch deck and an offering memorandum of the company, and listed all the companies that they could target that might be interested in the business, some strategic companies that may be interested in acquiring them. And then he also called back up the person that made the offer. And I'm just going to use numbers here. The company had offered X. Okay. It was millions of dollars, but it was X for the purposes of this discussion. And, had other people, and they had what is called a blind auction. They don't tell you what the price of the business is. They just said, make your best offer. And they provide all the information so people can look at it and make an offer. And so there were 4 companies out of 20 or 30 that the advisor went out and reached out to that made, letters of intent. They were really interested. They wanted to go to the next level. And one of them was the original company. Once that original company found out who the other people were that were at the table bidding, they were one of them was his main competitor. And he did not want that guy to buy the business. And it would put him at a significant competitive advantage. And so the negotiations kind of continued for a couple of months. And the end of the story, it's a lot of details to the story, but the end of the story is the same company that had offered X offered 3X to block out the guy that was a competitor. And so if he'd have got the business for X, he'd have got the deal of the century. It was still a great deal for him in his view that he paid 3X for it. And that shows you, when you have an expert and an advisor around, he had to pay a lot of money, for bringing on that advisor. And he just didn't really want to do it because he's an entrepreneur who can do it himself type of thing, and he had tried to do his type of thing. But once he got someone in there that kind of knew the ropes and who to approach and talk to and how to position it, he got 3X. Still had to write a big check, but it was a lot less than the money put in the bank, at 3X. So, stories both ways, just phenomenal of things that you learn.
Oh, it's definitely worth it to bring on the expert, right? Well, one thing I wanted to talk about a bit is a little bit of a perspective flip. We talked about it a bunch on the podcast before, talking about kind of more early stage entrepreneurship. And you have what I think we've started affectionately calling ugly baby syndrome, where you have your baby, you got your business that you've been working on. Everyone keeps calling your baby ugly, saying it's not worth it, but you believe in it, and you know that you can get there, and you know you can hit your goals and all that kind of stuff, and that people just don't see your vision yet. And that's a place that a lot of entrepreneurs wind up being, because you have to be protective of it. You have to believe in yourself, because not everyone's necessarily going to believe in you when you're still working out of your garage. But then what I think is really interesting, Marvin, is you're kind of touching the antonym of the ugly baby syndrome, which is what I would call the perfect baby syndrome, with the first story there, where it's, look, this is so good, I'm so confident in this that I'm not even seeing the opportunities in front of me anymore. And so I want to throw that over to you, Marvin. When do you think you start to see that shift in an entrepreneur, from your experience as an entrepreneur or with people that you've talked to? And then how do you try to combat that to kind of put the ego back away where it needs to be?
Well, it's a great question, and one that isn't talked about a lot. One of the questions that I get if I'm talking in front of a group or in, kind of mastermind type of environment, there's a lot of entrepreneurs around the table and they're kibitzing about, their business and challenges and problems, and the discussion shifts to selling their business, and someone will pipe up and say, why in the crap would I want to think about selling my business? I'm overwhelmed just running it on a day-to-day basis. I don't have time to think about selling. That's 10 years ago, 15 years from now. I just don't have time. Why would I do that? And it's a great question. And it kind of goes to what you're talking about here, is that you do it because you need to know generally what direction you're going in. And to answer your question, you make that shift when an entrepreneur really understands that he's not going to be able, unless he lives forever, he's not going to be able to operate his business for 50 years. At some point in time, only a couple, three things can happen to a business. One is that you're going to pass it on to family, someone inside the company, a management team, an employee, a partner, someone that you know. And if that's going to be kind of where direction you're heading in, then you do different types of things to prepare for that event. Or if there is not the next generation that's going to take over the business, then you kind of, are going to sell it to someone you don't know. And that's an entirely different environment. Or like my story here, something will go sideways and you'll have to wind it down and liquidate. You don't want that. So those are really the only three options: someone you know, don't know, or liquidate. Either voluntarily liquidate or involuntarily be pushed out of business. If those are your options, then it's bonehead logic that if that's the case, then you need to kind of pick one. Doesn't mean that that's what it's going to end up, but you need to kind of start moving into that direction. So when someone says, I don't have time, it's not the physical time that people invest, like hours a week or a day or a month. It's the thought process. It's thinking about, what am I doing today that's going to impact where I want to be in the future? You put the stake in the ground out on the horizon and you're headed in that general direction, and that's kind of your North Star, and you're heading there, and you go sideways, and but you always come back because you're headed that way. And there are things that you do in your business years in advance that will have a tremendous impact on the valuation of your business at that time, and the smoothness of the transaction if you don't pay attention. So it's more about a thought process, not actual hard labor that you're putting in working on your business. So that's what I tell folks that come back with that. Why do I want to think about it now? And put your ego aside. You just have to understand that when people come in and look at your business, they don't know you. They don't know where the skeletons are buried. They're going to do a colonoscopy, a financial colonoscopy on your business. And they're going to want to see things that you haven't even thought of. That why are they worried about that? And that's what happened to me. I had these people come in, accountants and attorneys come in, and they were going through every file and looking for, the unknown of what was buried. And it can get kind of offensive. People don't trust or believe you, and you just have to swallow and just say, okay.
All those things that you just took on, that you just used to do and you never really thought about, then somebody starts peeling the onions back. So it makes you feel like, well, didn't I do it right? And you get that weird sort of guilty feeling. And the other thing I was just thinking about is, Stephen Covey always talks about, begin with the end in mind. And, I work with clients on that same sort of thing, is what's the outcome? And I think what it is we get so task oriented, it's got to do the next thing, got to do the next thing.
Problem solving fever.
Yeah. It's what's next. Okay. That task is done. Move on to the next one. And nobody really shifts that mindset to what's the outcome I'm trying to achieve. And that's, I've sat in several pitches where they've actually asked, the founders, and this is like startup world pitches. They've asked the founders, so what is your exit strategy? And they play lip service to it, but there's no way they're truly thinking about it in that sense. So, I throw that out there as hey folks, if you ain't thinking about the outcome, you're gonna be in task mode, and that's all you'll ever be. So one of the things that and you touched on it a little bit, and this kind of makes me think about it some more in the startup pitch nights sort of environment, is where should somebody start the planning for actually exiting? Is it 24 months, 24 weeks, 24 hours? I know the last one's not real, but it rhymes really good in the flow. So when should somebody, that entrepreneur that's like, yeah, I think I want to spend more time with the grandkids, when should they start planning that?
Well, it's never too early. That's a tried answer. But again, I'll come back to my earlier comment. It's about a thought process. I'll give you an example from the podcast where a retail-oriented business was sort of iconic. It was in a very historical building in downtown. Everyone within 200-300 miles knew of the business. They'd been there for almost 30 years. It was a great business. Per square foot sales for that retailer was, like an Apple store. It was just really high, and things were just going along great. But just like you said, they're getting a little bit older, they start thinking about it. And the building that was owned by the founder's personal friend. And when it came time to negotiate the lease, it was kind of routine. It was 25 years ago that the lease was originally negotiated, and every 5 years they would just kind of sign a new lease and the rent would go up a little bit. They didn't even look at the terms of the lease or anything. And about 3 years before they had really set a time when they kind of wanted to exit, and the lease was up for renewal, and they did the same thing. They just signed the lease. And so now they have buyers at the table, and the attorney for the buyer looks and says, well, this lease is not transferable. We have to sign a new lease. Okay, that's not a problem. I'm sure my good buddy, the landlord, will execute a new lease. And he did. He sent over a lease 3 times the rent. Because when there's money on the table, kind of, friendship kind of goes out the window sometimes. Mm-hmm. And now that it was so really undervalued, under market at the time. And now that they were weeks away from closing, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that you have leverage. And without a lease, and you're selling a retail location, that ain't going to happen. And so the moral of the story is really they had to renegotiate the lease. And what happened, and I'm just going to use a number, let's say the business was worth $1 million. It was worth far more than that. But the lease was like $50,000, and he tripled the lease. So there was an extra $100,000, and the multiple on that business was 5, multiple of 5. And so when the profits go down by $100,000 because the lease payments went up $100,000, multiply that by 5, it's $500,000 of value that just went out the window. And I'm quite, the M&A advisor said on the podcast, he said, I'm quite sure that, having it in mind that you are going to be exiting and the decisions you're making today will impact what that value of the business is going to be down the road, that he could have gotten an assignment at that time. 3 years in advance, it would have probably been a no big deal. The business wasn't for sale at the time. It would have just been a normal type of thing. And but when he was backed up against the wall, it cost him $500,000. And so the answer to when do you start? Again, you need to start well in advance of all those contracts that you're signing. make sure that every contract you sign with an employee or a vendor or a real estate or equipment lease or whatever you're executing, you at least ask the question, how is this going to be viewed at the time of exit? Because it can have a dramatic impact at the time of exit. So to finally cap this off, I think you start the thought process a decade before. I think you start tactically putting things in place 2 or 3 years before. And if you do that, when it comes time to actually exit, you'll have all your ducks in a row. And when something goes sideways, you get a bad health diagnosis and things of that nature, and then you have to scramble to get things in ready. When everyone it's a fire drill, you just don't get things done as smoothly as and efficiently, and it creates doubt for the buyer when the information isn't complete. And if there's doubt, that's translated into risk, and risk drives down value and increases the terms. So,
there's a analogy here that I've been playing with as you've been talking, Marvin, and it's really, to start it off, I've heard this a bunch with athletes, whatever level you're talking about. And this is something I could say I personally experienced when I was playing rugby in college, is as soon as you reach that point where you start thinking about retirement, where you start thinking about hanging up the boots, your level of play drops off, where you just don't have that quick step anymore. And I was playing with that a bit because it seems like there would be, at least to some extent, a similar effect with the entrepreneur there. And so the question is then, how do you balance that? Because you don't want to be thinking so much about your exit that you're no longer running the business well on a daily basis. You don't want to, start thinking about retirement so much that you're a step slow as the entrepreneur, as the leader for that business. So how do you balance that? I know you just said it's basically, a decade ahead of time, you want to start thinking about it. And then 2 or 3 years out, you want to start really putting the math together, putting the work in on it. How do you balance that without losing your productivity on a regular basis, or losing your vision, losing the motivation for your team, all of those type of things that entrepreneurs are great at?
Well, I think that it's a really good question, because relating this to an athlete, when they get towards the end of their career and their production kind of drops off because they're in that frame of mind, they don't want to get hurt, that type of mentality.
Exactly. As soon as you don't want to get hurt, that's when you're done. As soon as that happens to you, it's when you're done.
Yeah. But again, it's hard to convey that if you get into the frame of mind that that things you're doing today is going to translate into dollars, sometimes zeros, 10,000, 100,000, $1 million of value at that time if you do A, B, and C. If you get into that frame of mind, instead of looking at all the things you're going to be doing after you sell the business, if you get into the frame of mind of thinking that I still have to do A, B, and C to get, an extra $500,000 out of my business, and I need to keep on task to do that and keep the pedal to the metal, so your sales are still growing and you're still moving and you're still innovating. And you get into that frame of mind where you equate it to dollars and cents when you actually do step away from your business, it's much easier to stay in the forward momentum time frame. But as you said, if you don't have that and you start looking at the things you're going to be doing when you sell, and you start taking time off because now the business is working well and you have a good team in place, and you start spending time away from the office and the shop, and when the founder is not there, the people play, and that Christmas kind of disappears. And the last thing you want to go to market with is where your sales have been growing year after year by 5-10% a year, and then it drops to 3%, or maybe even a -2%. You've kind of plateaued because you don't have your eye on the ball. What is that going to do to the buyer? Raise questions. What's going on? And if you would have just kept the same growth rate, you may get an extra $1 million, $500,000, whatever, because it's predictable, and there's still a ways to grow. But the minute you take your eye off the ball, and it's one of the things that always happens, and it's very difficult. And it takes a lot of self-discipline to keep that, foot on the gas pedal when you know that it's going to be a year from now. And it's very difficult to do. But if you translate it to dollars, that tends to keep people a little bit more focused. I just have to do this for another year. I can make another $500,000. I just have to stay focused. And that makes it easier.
I love that.
That's so true. It's the staying in that whole athlete sort of thing. It's that finishing on a mindset, right? Or not a mindset, but the high point of your career. To walk away. I think of Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning walked away after winning a Super Bowl. He doesn't try for one more. He knows.
Good example.
That's it,
Walk
right?
away when you're on a winning streak. Don't try to milk everything out of the business, because it never works out.
No, because even if you just continue to think about the athletes over the years, in that same sense, is so true in business. They try for that one more thing, or that, and everybody's already told them, and they already know in their mind, that in the back of their mind, they know that this year was probably, or last year was probably the year I should have hung them up, right? It's just so true, and it's funny how relatable that is to business. I hadn't thought about it at this point.
Yeah, well, I think, the more we're talking on it, the more it speaks to Marvin's point, because I started thinking about other, elite NFL quarterbacks and who didn't hang it up at quite the right time, and how your perspective on them changes so much. I remember growing up, I'm at the right age for this, where I thought Brett Favre was like one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. And then I watched what happened when he went to Minnesota. And actually, I've read it. He actually put up pretty dang good numbers over there. But still, when he made that transition, when he came out of retirement and made that transition, it completely blew him up. And it's like, he was good, but, he's not a great anymore. And, to Marvin, to your point, that's that extra $1 million that he just lost in the sale of his business.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll tell you is that when people, you have to put yourself in the chair of the buyer. And that's something that founders and entrepreneurs just don't do very often. They don't actually walk around to the other side of the table, sit in the chair of a buyer, and ask the questions. Would you pay? And I've asked entrepreneurs this, would you pay the amount of money that you're asking for the business, knowing what you know about the business? And they kind of shuffle their feet, look down at the desk, and, well, you got a good point there, and yet they're asking somebody else to write that big check. And so when you put yourself in the chair of the buyer, and one of the things, just like you said, you never want to sell the business when you've plateaued, because the buyer is going to look and say, oh, there's not a lot of opportunity here yet. It still may be a good business, but it's not growing anymore. You always want to sell the business when there is another year or two of really good growth. That's when you want to exit, because you'll have multiple people lining up to buy the business. You're going to have that competitive bidding situation many times, and people aren't, they want the business that has growth. So if you were buying the business, would you want to buy a business that is kind of petered out and sales have plateaued or going down? Or would you want to buy a business that looks like it's going to have 5 or 10% growth year after year for the next few years? I'm not even going to insult people by asking, which one would you want to buy if you were a buyer?
Wait. Let's think about that one for a minute.
Yeah. And so
don't strain yourself on the math, Dad.
Yeah. So that's what people don't do. They don't put themselves in the chair of the buyer.
Oh, Marvin, that's great. And boy, I tell you what, bringing this back to the whole athlete thing, at least for me, it really helps frame it in a layman's terms. And I think there's enough folks out there that watch a couple of NFL games, every couple of months, that might understand that analogy, that metaphor also. So that great points, great lessons, man. Folks, take your time and prepare for the exit.
This is a notebook podcast, definitely.
Another notebook podcast.
One of the things
to other guests, by the way.
For your people that listen to your podcast, I've prepared kind of a little report. I've had a lot of feedback from people that listen to podcasts, say kind of what's next type of thing. And I'm actually writing a book It's going to be called Pack Your Parachute. And it's based on the metaphor that, pilots don't pack their parachute when the engines are on fire. That parachute is packed and ready to go. And if they need it, they grab it and jump. And, so I prepared this report that kind of outlines that, kind of frame of mind and thinking. And it's downloadable if you just go to the podcast, which is businessexitstories.com/report, and just download the report there. It's a quick read. It's in PDF format, and it'll give you kind of the big picture of things that you need to start considering, in advance type of thing. So
awesome, Marvin. This has been great, man. And my favorite part of every show that we've done out of all the shows is always what you learn. And you said something. I've heard it as a method of selling your business and part of selling your business, but I never heard the actual term and the earnout. I thought, how simple is that? Why didn't it just, but it is. I mean, that's a great option for business owners that, it's not the same. I've always tried to correlate it to real estate, but in that case, earnout would be, maybe it's like renting back your house. I think might be a good metaphor for that. And go ahead.
I was going to say the ideal situation to be in is have a business that's so strong that so many people want that they're willing to pay you 100% cash for the business with no earnout.
Yeah.
You start backing away from the 100% cash when there's risk involved, when there's uncertainty, and people will hedge their bet by giving you not all the money now, but if you actually achieve what you say you can achieve, then we'll pay you over time. The problem is, as you'll learn on the podcast, there are people that buy businesses out there that structure earnouts where it's almost impossible to achieve getting paid because they do this every day. And this poor entrepreneur hasn't done it all the time, and he thinks he can achieve this earnout, but it's structured in such a way that it's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to hit that number. And so those are the type of things that you need. Since it isn't your first rodeo, it's your first rodeo, you just need to be aware of those type of things.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Camden, what'd you learn?
Well, I got a couple. My first one here is, it makes me think back to, you go through different decision-making stuff in economics. People are really, really good at buying milk. They're really bad at choosing spouses because you only do one once, you do one every week. And the trick there is you got to read the book ahead of time if you're going to get it right. And so go listen to Marvin's podcast and start and read his book when the book comes out, but listen to the podcast and start practicing that, because you're only going to make this decision and, go this route once or twice in your life. And so you want to make sure you're as prepared as you can by, trying to practice by listening to a podcast. The second thing was, and I'm really bringing this full circle. I had no idea on this. So I wrote down earlier in the podcast, memento mori for business, going back to our Stoic quotes. And really, when you think about memento mori, it's, remember that you will die. It's not dwell every day on your death. That's the misconception people get on it, is that it's like every day you're depressed because you're thinking that I'm going to die one day. Instead, it's taking that, understanding it, accepting it, but then also it's still off in the future. That's not right now. It's going to happen one day and you accept that, but you're not going to dwell on it and let it ruin your life right now. And that's basically what we've been talking about with the business exit, is that at one point you will need to exit. At one point, you're going to want to sell your business. And it doesn't mean it needs to take away from what you're doing right now, but it needs to be something that's always in the back of your mind.
Well put. And I've hadn't thought of it in that way, but that's absolutely true.
Marvin, what'd you learn?
Well, I just love chatting. I think that, you're talking to you and you say you're a rugby player. I've had some very close friends that are rugby players. That is about the roughest sport out there. I mean, it is brutal, and, when you had said, that you take the eye off the ball, and when you start thinking about not getting hurt, that's when you get hurt. Mm-hmm. And so I think that applies to the whole business attitude. You don't want to think about necessarily your exit, because that's when you take the foot off the gas. And when you take foot off the gas and start coasting and not spending the time in the office and things like that, that's when bad things happen. And so you just need to, keep your eye focused on that number, if I do A, B, C, I'm going to make another $500,000 or 200 or a million or whatever that number is. And you keep focused on that. That brings clarity to what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah, that's great, man. I appreciate that. Tell us again, give us the URL. How can people get in contact with you, follow the podcast? Go ahead. Give us those details again, please.
Yeah, I think that any entrepreneur out there that likes stories and takeaways from stories, there's 4 on every podcast, good and bad stories. It's just wherever you get your podcast, Apple, Google, Stitcher, wherever. It's business exit stories. And for the downloadable PDF that talks about optimizing the value of your business, it's just businessexitstories.com/report.
That's great. I really appreciate it, man. That's businessexitstories.com. And also the podcast is Business Exit Stories. And a lot of great things going on here. And, that's always my favorite. If you ain't planning, you're falling behind, you're going to screw it up. So take a listen to the podcast. And if you don't have a plan to exit, man, you better add this podcast to your short playlist. Camden, run us out, please.
Exactly. If you're early on in your business, sprinkle it in every now and then so you just get those thoughts flowing. All right. Thank you all for listening to today's show. Special thanks to our guest, Marvin Storm, for joining us today, and our sponsor, Tribe and Purpose. Find your tribe, find your purpose. You can check out recent episodes of the Cam and Otis Show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, and check out a full archive at thecamandotisshow.buzzsprout.com. The Cam and Otis Show is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again, and we'll see y'all next week.